On 5 March 2013, 4 Polish climbers stood on the summit of Broad Peak, a giant in the Karakoram Range in Pakistan, at 8,047 meters. It was the first time anyone had climbed this mountain in winter. Only 2 of them made it back to camp. What happened to the other 2 in the hours that followed is still not fully known. Broad Peak sits in the Karakoram, near K2, in one of the most severe high-altitude environments on Earth. In winter, the temperatures drop far below anything a human body can handle for long, and the air holds barely a third of the oxygen found at sea level. The route the climbers used ran from Camp Avir, at roughly 7,400 meters, up through a stretch of broken glacier riddled with crevasses, then across a high pass called Broad Col, near 7,900 meters, before climbing toward a rocky subpeak known as Rocky Summit at about 8,028 meters. Only past Rocky Summit does the true summit come into view. That hidden shape would matter later, because reaching the top was only half the climb. Getting back down, in the dark, in the cold, would prove to be the real danger. One of the 4 climbers on that summit push had already stood near this mountain once before. In March 1988, Maciej Berbeka took part in a fast attempt on Broad Peak during a Polish winter expedition aimed at K2. In strong wind and fading light, he reached Rocky Summit at about 8,028 meters and believed, at the time, that he had reached the main summit. He was wrong. The true summit was still about 400 horizontal meters away. He bivouacked in the open near the pass and survived the night. There is no evidence that his teammates deceived him about this, and no reason to think he returned to Broad Peak 25 years later, chasing some kind of redemption. What we do know is that in 2013, Berbeka was back on the same mountain, one of Poland's most experienced winter Himalayan climbers, at 58 years old. The 2013 expedition was led by Krzysztof Bielecki, a veteran of Polish winter Himalayism, a climbing tradition built on trying to summit the world's highest peaks in the harshest season. Alongside Berbeka were 3 younger climbers. Adam Bielecki was 29, Artur Małek was 33, and Tomasz Kowalski was 27. A Pakistani climber named Karim Hayat was also part of the support effort on the mountain. The team set up a chain of camps as they worked their way up, at approximately 5,600, 620,000, 7,400 meters. A later investigation found the equipment and acclimatization plan generally sound, and all 4 summit climbers had already slept above 7,000 meters before their push. But there was a gap that would matter. Rescue oxygen. Oxygen meant for emergencies rather than for the summit push itself had been recommended by a doctor beforehand, but was not carried up to the highest camps. The plan itself had a second weakness. Bielecki had originally wanted 2 separate pairs of climbers, moving a day apart, but the 4 climbers preferred to go together as one team, and he agreed. There was no hard turnaround time set for the day, no clear procedure if one climber became dangerously weak, and no one formally named as the leader of the summit push, though in practice, Berbeka functioned as one. On 3 March, the 4 moved from base camp to Camp I. On 4 March, they pushed straight from Camp I to Camp IV at roughly 7,400 meters, arriving in need of rest. They then had only the remaining hours before departure to recover for the hardest day. At 05:15 on 5 March, Berbeka, Bielecki, Kowalski, and Małek left Camp Avir at dawn. A later commission would judge this departure too late, though experts disagreed on the point, since leaving any earlier in full darkness carried its own frostbite risk. Above roughly 7,700 meters, the route crossed 3 crevasses, deep cracks in the glacier ice. The hardest one needed a fixed rope to cross safely. Berbeka and Bielecki took turns leading the way. By 12:30, after more than 7 hours of climbing, the group reached Broad Col, the high pass at about 7,900 meters, with Bielecki arriving first, then Berbeka, then Małek, and Kowalski behind them. Above the pass, the group split into 2 roped pairs, Bielecki with Małek and Berbeka with Kowalski. This was normal mountaineering practice for the terrain, but the terrain itself was worse than expected. The ground before Rocky Summit was harder and slower going than the team had planned for, and that slowness would eat into the hours they had left before dark. Around 15,000, Bielecki, coordinating from below, raised the question of turning back. The 4 climbers chose to continue. It was a decision that would shape everything that came after. By around 16,000, The team reached Rocky Summit, the same rocky subpeak Berbeka had mistaken for the true top back in 1988, at approximately 8,028 meters. Again, they decided to press on toward the real summit. And at or around this point, Bielecki and Małek untied from each other. A later investigation would conclude that from this moment, the four climbers effectively stopped functioning as one team. They were now four individuals, moving at their own pace toward the same goal. At 1720, Adam Bielecki reached the main summit of Broad Peak. At 1750, Artur Małek reached it too. At 18 through, Berbeka and Kowalski arrived together. In total, only 40 minutes separated the first climber on top from the last. Conditions that evening were later described as nearly windless, cloudless, and fully visible, with temperatures overnight falling to somewhere between -29 and -35 degrees Celsius. There was no sudden storm. The danger here was not the weather closing in, it was simply the clock, the cold, and the altitude, working against four exhausted people already many hours into their day. All four began descending immediately and individually, each finding their own way back down through the darkness that was now closing in. Soon after 18 throughs, or by around 19 throughs, Tomasz Kowalski radioed that he was suddenly and severely weak, cold, struggling to breathe, and unable to climb back up over Rocky Summit, an obstacle he now had to cross again on the way down. His radio worked poorly, and his speech was often difficult to understand. Berbeka made no recorded radio contact of his own during the descent that night, though earlier, on the way up, he had spoken to base camp using Kowalski's radio. What happened next, between the two of them, is one of the biggest gaps in the entire story. Investigators could not determine where, or for how long, Berbeka and Kowalski descended together, or whether they became separated. One exchange remembered later by Bielecki may suggest the two men were still together at some point that night, but investigators said this could reflect what actually happened, or simply Kowalski's confused state as his condition worsened. It is also worth saying clearly that a crampon coming loose has been mentioned in accounts of that night, but the later investigation found no disabling orthopedic injury and did not identify the crampon as the cause of what followed. At 22,000, Bielecki reached Camp Ave at around 7,400 meters. After resting briefly, he tried to climb back up to help the others, managed only a short distance, and turned back, exhausted. At 02,000 on 6 March, Małek also reached Camp Ave. According to Bielecki's later account, the last radio contact with Kowalski came at around 06:30 that morning. Berbeka's position at that hour was unknown. In the morning, Małek tried once more to climb upward, carrying liquids for the missing men, but managed only about 30 meters in half an hour before turning back, exhausted himself. Karim Hayat climbed from Camp I up to Camp Ive, and then higher, to the first crevasse near 7,000 meters. Visibility was good that day, but he saw no sign of either missing climber. Bielecki descended all the way to base camp on 6 March, while Małek and Hayat stayed at Camp Ive in case they could still help. A later commission would criticize the timing of Bielecki's descent, given that Berbeka's fate was still unknown, though it approved the eventual decision to bring Małek and Hayat down as well. By 7 March, after 2 nights on the mountain without bivouac equipment, Bielecki accepted there was no realistic chance either man had survived. The expedition was formally called off on 8 March. No exact time of death was ever established for either climber, and none should be claimed here. Months later, in July, a search team located Tomasz Kowalski's body in a steep rock chimney below the final tower leading up to Rocky Summit. He was still attached to the fixed rope by a sling and a sender, and he had no backpack or camera with him. His body was later moved and buried about 100 meters lower on the mountain. Maciej's Berbeka's body has never been found. Some early reports suggested Kowalski had stayed near the pass that night, but the position where his body was eventually found contradicts that idea. Where he actually spent the night remains unknown. The Polish Mountaineering Association's final commission published its findings in September 2013. It concluded that the expedition's preparation, equipment, and acclimatization had generally been good, but it identified a list of errors. No medical oxygen at the highest camp, despite an earlier recommendation, no hard turnaround time, no plan for what to do if a climber became severely weakened, no clearly designated leader for the summit attempt, a departure the Commission considered too late in the day, a failure to turn back despite an already slow pace, inadequate radios, and a weak base camp communication setup, and, at the center of it, the separation of the four-person team above Rocky Summit. The Commission called the loss of visual and radio contact between the climbers a fundamental error, and it assigned the greatest share of responsibility for that loss of group unity to Bielecki, while also raising serious reservations about Małek's decisions that day. At the same time, the Commission acknowledged there was not enough evidence to say for certain that staying together would have saved everyone, and it allowed that Bielecki and Małek may genuinely have believed, at the time, that their own lives were in danger. As for what killed each man, the Commission could only go so far. For Kowalski, the probable cause was a dramatic physical breakdown brought on by extreme exertion and altitude, worsened by hypothermia, the dangerous drop in body temperature that follows prolonged cold exposure. No disabling injury was ever confirmed. For Berbeka, no direct cause could be determined at all. Altitude sickness, hypothermia, or some kind of accident on the descent all remain possibilities, and nothing more definite than that. What is certain is this. On 5 March 2013, 4 climbers reached the true summit of Broad Peak in winter for the first time in history. Bielecki and Artur Małek made it back down. Tomasz Kowalski's body was found 4 months later and buried on the mountain. Maciej Berbeka was never found. The first winter ascent of Broad Peak stands as a real and verified achievement. What happened to 2 of the 4 men who made it possible, in the hours of darkness that followed, is a story the record can only partly tell.